So Julian is a friend of ours. He works at UNCF and has just been a great partner in helping us understand the needs of the folks in Atlanta. And think about when we're trying to help a region get reemployed, we need to focus on those who need the help the most. And that's where UNCF has been a huge aid to us. And he'll talk a lot about that partnership. Julian got his undergrad at Morehouse College, and then got a law degree from Harvard Law School. And Julian, maybe you can talk a little bit more about what UNCF does, and then talk about how we're using the data.
Awesome, thank you. So once again, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you all. My name is Julian Thompson, and I currently serve as strategist for UNCF, for the United Negro College Fund. Over the course of this year, we've had the pleasure to work with the folks at Emsi and the Harvard Kennedy School of Government on a groundbreaking effort to focus on reskilling and upskilling for disadvantaged populations. And so I'm really excited to be able to share with you some of the preliminary findings of that work, and also share a little bit of the genesis as to why we started it in the first place. So as I said, this is an effort that is a joint initiative. First, UNCF was involved and is involved in this work because we are a champion for minority students, communities, and institutions. There are currently 101 historically Black colleges and universities in the country, and UNCF is a consortium for 37 of them. And so we consider ourselves, number one, an thought leader and expert on questions involving historically Black colleges and universities, but also want to speak to the needs of institutions, organizations, and communities that center minority students, center disadvantaged students, figure out the best ways to support those that need a leg up. So we come to this work from an equity perspective. We were excited to partner with the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. They are an expert on local, state, and federal policymaking. They convene mayors and governors that work at the federal level, spearhead efforts in workforce development. And they also work as a convener of regional economic systems and workforce systems. You're going to hear a little bit more over the course of this talk about how that workforce regional approach and how working with organizations and institutions across a region ends up being critically important when you think about the pipelines for reskilling and upskilling. And then finally, it's been our pleasure to work with Emsi, our data and skills partner. As you all know, because you're attendee to this conference, Emsi is a leader in labor market data analytics. And they've also developed a skills taxonomy that has been truly exciting to introduce to Atlanta stakeholders and to HBCUs over the course of this year. So why is UNCF in particular involved in this work? Our leader, Dr. Michael Lomax, had a conversation with Stephen Goldsmith at the Harvard Kennedy School in 2019, and they looked at the landscape of the economic status of our country. And what they saw is obviously of no surprise to anyone who's on this video, that we have an economic and an income inequality issue, and that it continues to shape the American economy. You'll see on the left-hand side of the screen that the highest 20%, earning 20% of families in the United States made more than half of all the income. And you'll also see that the richest families in our country are the ones that have gained wealth since the recession. So Dr. Lomax and Steve Goldsmith were thinking about these questions and thinking about what they meant for how you figure out a thoughtful, concerted approach to supporting those who are disadvantaged economically to get them on the upward path for economic mobility. We also reflected on a real persistence of challenges in the Black community itself. And so this is a slide that UNCF put together comparing statistics collected from the 1960s to today. And what you can see is that when you measure the gap between Black performance and white performance in the 1960s, and you compare that gap in performance to the gap that you see in today's economy and today's society, you see that the percentage of the gap is almost exactly the same as it existed in the 1960s. So on everything from educational attainment to unemployment, from incarceration to wages and income, wealth and health, we continue to see not only those economic gaps that were identified on the previous slide, but the continuation of racial gaps that all leaders, whether they be in higher education, workforce, government, the corporate sector, ought to address. And so these dual persistent challenges of economic inequality and racial injustice really were the genesis for the project that we undertook with Emsi and with our friends at the Harvard Kennedy School. The theory behind the Atlanta pilot was essentially threefold. Number one, there was a realization that you have a host of stakeholders within a region that are all focused on skills, reskilling, and upskilling. So of course you have the K-12 system and higher education that are focused on finding students and making sure that they have the skills they need for college and career. And then you have workforce partners focused on the same. In addition, you have employers who obviously want to be the recipients of people with quality skills. And then you have government that's looking out for the well-being of all citizens. Each of these entities is thinking about skills, reskilling, and upskilling at the same time, but oftentimes are using different information, different data, different theories about how the pipeline works. And then when you go under the hood a little bit and you start to ask questions of each of those partners, you find that they oftentimes have different objectives when it comes to population served, who's disadvantaged, who you want to target. The theory behind the Atlanta Workforce Project was that you can bring all of those stakeholders together: government, employers, workforce partners, higher education, and the K-12 system, and do so under the common guise of thinking, number one, about equity, and number two, giving all of those entities the same language using both data analytics and the skills taxonomy that Emsi introduced. This slide is an indicator of us casting a broad net. And so when we undertook this pilot in Atlanta, we wanted to make sure to include the Atlanta public school system and the charter system. We included both the community colleges and traditional four-year colleges. We included workforce groups and folks like the chamber that have direct relationships to employers. And what ended up being really powerful about the pilot is that when you engage them all, you start by having a conversation about all their different priorities and values, but then you center them using the exact same information on skills that's been developed by Emsi. We've undertaken some major activities here. And so number one, we convened a multi-stakeholder group to discuss each of their individual and joint reskilling and upskilling efforts. Then we were able to introduce all of those stakeholders to two dashboards that have been recently developed by Emsi. First, Skillscape, and then the reemployment dashboard. For those of you who aren't familiar with Emsi's analytical tools, Skillscape basically is a combination of two really robust data systems. The first is a data system that does a scan of job postings within a region. And so Emsi is able to do a pretty robust analysis using their skills taxonomy on the 98% of job postings that exist within a region. And then the second data set is a set of information on job postings and employee information that's being posted within a region. Once you have those two data systems in the same place for a stakeholder, once you have the job posting information and the employee information, it gives you an enormous opportunity to create synergies, to understand where opportunities are to bridge gaps between gaps in the pipeline, where you can make connections, let's say, between K-12 and higher education, or between higher education and some workforce groups, or between workforce and groups and employers. If everyone's using the same analytics, using the same thinking, not just about traditional labor market data, but also about how skills works, you can provide a baseline for a whole new way of thinking about how to create a regional strategy. Working with the folks at Emsi, and I want to give a quick shout out to the folks at Emsi that we've worked with on this project, including Dustin Lester, Dr. Justina Saleh, and Hector Acosta. It's been wonderful to work with them. We developed a report on equity concerns and reskilling and upskilling priorities ought to be prioritized in the Atlanta area, and we're able to present that report to rave reviews to the number of the stakeholders in the Atlanta region. We also, our colleagues at Harvard Kennedy School and Jane Wiseman in particular, published best practice articles on reskilling and upskilling for consumption. There are essentially 3 learnings, and we're still in the middle of the project, and you're going to learn a little bit more over the course of the conference about sort of how the work is played out. But I wanted to make sure to share sort of 3 preliminary findings that we're really seeing in the work. First, education and workforce partners have really been able to identify multiple uses of the skills taxonomy. And it was maybe a happy surprise that we were able to take on this work in the midst of COVID. We started the planning for the work in January, but did our launch event in April. And by that time, so many of the stakeholders that we engaged were laser focused on how they could figure out new strategies for reskilling and upskilling. And so when you looked at the stakeholders that we engaged and how they used both either Skillscape or the reemployment dashboard, they were identifying goals for upskilling into middle-class jobs. They were identifying how to redesign or reshape programs, including syllabi and curriculum. They created new assumptions about the workforce that allowed them to reshape what their approach would be to employers. And based on the skills information that they now have, it's in real time in the region of question, they were able to make connections to employers using real-time information. The second real important finding from this work has been that embedding equity measures into the dashboards allowed a number of our partners to focus strategically on engagement of excluded populations. In the Atlanta pilot dashboard, we were able to create a number of tools within the dashboard that looked in particular at African American attainment of jobs according to certain skill sets. So if a mayor or a workforce group or a higher education institution has a goal or objective of uplifting a certain disadvantaged population, and then the Atlanta circumstance in particular of uplifting the Black population, we were able to identify the trends that were most important for that community and then let that enable strategic decision making. The most powerful, I think, lesson for the work is the third one, and that's that with the right leadership, it is possible to get everyone in a regional ecosystem, or at least as many folks as possible, on the same page. One of the aha learnings of the pilot was that because you have the public school system and the higher education system and the workforce system all being trained in the same way, using the same dashboard, all of a sudden they're able to communicate to each other in ways that hadn't really existed before, and therefore plan for what we know has to be a lifelong learning process if folks are to achieve the jobs and the income that we know is possible. And so those are 3 really important lessons that we learned in the Atlanta project, and one that we hope to continue to learn more about as the work continues. At UNCF, we're combining the work that's happening in Atlanta, where we think about that networked approach to reskilling and upskilling, with some additional pieces as well that are about what it takes to actually focus on excluded populations, right? Because you can use the skills taxonomy to identify what program to create, in what industry, in what organization. But if you don't have the right program design, if you're not intentional about the needs of excluded populations and the ways in which the previous systems have failed to support them or failed to engage in ways that lead to their success, then you're going to end up continuing to perpetuate status quo solutions. And so at UNCF, we're really excited to move along these two trains at the same time, where we, number one, focus on the network and focus on pipelines and bridges. And at the same time, get really intentional as we engage stakeholders across the country on the values that are most important for engaging excluded populations. UNCF was able to join a national coalition that also included Emsi and 50 or 60 national organizations that essentially spoke to these needs and these values. It said, in essence, that if you're going to focus on excluded populations, if you're saying that you're a workforce group, that you're focused on skills, and that your goal is to help excluded populations rise up the ladder of opportunity, that in addition to making the right network connection, you have to focus on cultures of belongingness so that excluded populations feel that they have a seat at the table and have their culture and values respected. You have to develop agency and personal assets, and in some ways figure out how you want to share power. You have to invest not only in hard skills, but in soft skills. And that was one of the great pieces about Skillscape, is that it includes both in the ability to do analysis and strategic planning. You have to invest in organizational culture, because you don't want to send excluded populations to communities or to organizations that don't welcome them and haven't thought about the values that are most important for their needs. And then, of course, you want to invest in accountability, and accountability from the perspective of the excluded population, and also in transformative access. And so it's been a wonderful process to learn about the Atlanta regional ecosystem and about the power of using skills in the skills taxonomy. I want to encourage all of the attendees at today's conference to lean in on these conversations about skills, because in particular, if you're focused on equity considerations, it's a great window to start some really important conversations that we just haven't been able to have in a thoughtful way for a long time. And so with that, I want to turn it back over to Andrew and any questions you all might have. But once again, I want to thank our partners at Emsi and at Harvard for being able to participate in what has been a truly exciting pilot in the middle of a very crazy year. Andrew? But was your question, Andrew, about the way that the work can expand to other cities and to other spaces? So we are actually in conversation right now about the ways in which this work can expand. And so would encourage you to reach out if that's something that you're interested in terms of UNCF. Our funder has indicated that they're interested in expansion to other spaces. I think you're also going to learn a little bit over the conference today about the way that Emsi is developing these tools for consumers of all types to use. And so please feel free to reach out to me for additional insights on the Atlanta project, or to the good folks at Emsi themselves to hear more about how Emsi is positioning those tools. I'm going to answer a question from the chat. Janice asked if there's a way using the dashboard to be able to engage in underemployment. And for us, that was a really important question, particularly when we looked at the Black population in Atlanta. The folks at Emsi were able to embed something in Skillscape called the African American ratio, where you're able to identify based on skill set and based on industry, those areas that have a high percentage or a high African American ratio relative to their population, and where it's low relative to their population. Those two analyses end up being important for different reasons. Number one, if you want to see where Black people work now, you use the high ratio and then make the connections to the skills of the future. If you want to identify those areas where there's real opportunity for industry growth on the equity question, you start to use the low ratio indicators and produce metrics from there. So we're ended up being really pleased with the African American ratio component of Skillscape, if you're able to engage with that a little bit later today. And I would really play around with both the high ratio and the low ratio to start to give you insights about what the future might hold.